When an airline staff member mistreats an elderly war veteran, Tulsi Gabbard steps in, and what she does next leaves everyone speechless. D.C. Reagan Airport buzzed with announcements as passengers hurried to catch their flights, unaware of the remarkable presence about to join them. It was none other than the renowned U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, endorsed by the Trump administration and holding one of the highest security clearances in the country. It was no surprise that no one recognized her discreet presence. Moving through the terminal without fanfare or an entourage, she blended seamlessly with the crowd. But as she navigated past travelers, she accidentally stumbled into a trolley stacked with bags, pushed by an elderly man who could barely walk. She quickly realized her mistake, excused herself, and marched toward her destination. She had a flight to catch to New York for a top-secret security conference concerning refugees and asylum seekers. But just as she was about to leave, a sudden noise caught her attention. It sounded like something had fallen to the floor. Following the sound, she turned to see that the trolley she had accidentally stumbled into had toppled over, and the elderly man was now on the ground, struggling to pick up the scattered bags. His frail back trembled under the weight, and in pain he called out, "Excuse me, can anyone help me?" But his cry wasn't loud enough to make anyone stop. As Tulsi watched, she saw a reflection of herself in the elderly man. She recalled her early days training for the intelligence department. Coming from a different ethnicity and being the only female in her batch, she had endured relentless racism. Memories flooded back of times she had cried for help, only to be ignored. She refused to let history repeat itself. Moved by empathy, she stepped forward to assist him. But just as she was about to reach him, she noticed a man stopping by. Relief washed over her, thinking the situation was resolved and she could continue on her way. But it wasn't that simple. Meanwhile, the elderly man grasped the coat of the airline staff who had stopped, pleading, "Please, ma'am, help me carry these bags." At first, the staff member seemed empathetic, but her true colors emerged in an instant. With a sharp thrust, she shoved the old man's hand away and sneered, "Old man, get your son to do it." Despite the airport being crowded with people, no one bothered to stop or call out the blatant disrespect. But Tulsi, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, remained in place. Her eyes burned with anger, yet she didn't react. She wanted to see just how far this would go. The elderly man grasped the staff member's coat once more and pleaded, "Son, I am a war veteran. I spent my life fighting for this country without having a child of my own. You're like a son to me. Please help me. I can't lift all this on my own." His words echoed in Tulsi's mind. She had always felt a deep connection to war veterans, and seeing one struggle like this was unbearable. But the airline staff, unmoved, shoved the old man aside and scoffed, "Whatever, old man. I've got work to do." During the confrontation, the frail veteran stumbled, suffering a slight injury. That was the breaking point for Tulsi. She had seen enough. The sheer inhumanity of it all, the callousness, the indifference of the crowd, and the few onlookers who watched as if it were mere entertainment, ignited something in her. Tulsi knew she had to act, but she couldn't expose herself directly. Thinking fast, she pulled out her phone and called a close friend, the director of aviation, who also happened to be her tennis partner. The moment Tulsi explained the situation, her friend was shocked. A call from the director of intelligence wasn't something to take lightly. Without hesitation, she took immediate action, dispatching the airport manager to handle the matter. But before the manager could arrive, Tulsi saw the airline staff hastily trying to escape. This time, she didn't wait. Stepping forward, she intercepted her, determined to stall for time until reinforcements arrived. Tulsi stepped in front of the fleeing airline staff, her presence alone enough to halt her in her tracks. There was nothing imposing about her stance. She didn't need to be. The weight of her gaze, steady and unreadable, was enough to unsettle anyone. The young woman, oblivious to who she was, huffed impatiently, shifting her weight from foot to foot. She had no idea she was about to be tested in a way she would never forget. "What's your rush?" Tulsi asked, her voice measured, not aggressive but carrying an undertone of quiet authority. She didn't need to raise it. People who truly held power never did. The airline worker scoffed, crossing her arms. "Listen, lady, I got things to do. Airport's busy, and I don't have time to babysit some old guy." Tulsi barely reacted. Her expression remained composed, as if weighing the very fabric of her words. It wasn't her ignorance that intrigued her. It was the ease with which she dismissed her actions. She had wronged someone, and yet she felt no compulsion to reflect, let alone make it right. "So, your job is more important than human decency?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. The woman frowned. "I never said that." "But that's what your actions say." A few heads had turned by now. The passers-by, who had moments ago been too busy to interfere, were suddenly slowing their pace. It was the nature of people. When conflict brewed, they gravitated toward it, not to resolve it, but to witness it unfold. The young woman let out a sharp breath, her impatience bubbling over. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I don't owe you an explanation." Tulsi nodded slightly, as if that was exactly the response she had expected. "You don't owe me one," she agreed, "but you owe him one." She inclined her head toward the elderly veteran, who was still struggling to gather his things, his body hunched over in silent defeat. A man who had likely stood taller than most in his youth, now reduced to pleading for help in a place that should have embraced him with gratitude. The crowd was watching now, a slow, growing hum of murmurs spreading among them. Yet still, no one acted. And that was the real problem, wasn't it? Tulsi could see it clearly. This wasn't just about the airline worker. This was about the bystanders, the ones who had witnessed injustice and done nothing. It was always easier to look away, to convince oneself that it wasn't their place to step in. But what did that say about them? "Funny, isn't it?" she said, more to the crowd than to the woman. "How silence is always the easiest choice." The weight of her words settled in the air. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others stiffened, knowing deep down she was right. The young airline worker, still caught in the conversation she had no way of escaping, shifted uncomfortably. "Why are you making a big deal out of this?" she grumbled. "It's not like I hurt him." Tulsi's gaze sharpened. "Didn't you?" The question wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation for her to think, to process. But she wasn't holding her breath for an epiphany. Change never came that easily. The airport manager had arrived by now, but he hadn't interrupted. Something about Tulsi's presence, her ability to turn words into a slow-burning fire, had captivated him. He had dealt with unruly passengers before, but this was different. He wasn't just witnessing a confrontation, he was witnessing a lesson in motion. And so was the crowd. One by one, as if breaking free from an invisible chain, a few passengers stepped forward. A woman in a business suit bent down to pick up a fallen bag. A teenager with headphones slung around his neck helped lift the toppled trolley. Even a man in uniform, who had been merely watching from afar, joined in, steadying the veteran's arm as he got back on his feet. Tulsi didn't move. She simply observed. For a moment it seemed as though the world had corrected itself, that people, given the right nudge, could remember what it meant to be human. But she wasn't here to let them off the hook so easily. "You shouldn't have needed a spectacle to do this," she said, her voice cutting through the sudden stillness. "He needed help long before I stopped you." Guilt hung in the air. Those who had stepped forward just moments ago now felt the sting of the truth, because she was right. It wasn't kindness, if it only came when an audience was watching. The airline worker, still fuming, crossed her arms and glared at the crowd around her. "Okay, you've made your point," she muttered. "Can I go now?" Tulsi didn't reply immediately. She stood there, her eyes locked on the worker, not with anger, but with quiet intensity. She had already said what needed to be said, and now she allowed the weight of her presence to linger. Instead of responding directly to the worker, Tulsi turned her attention towards the airport manager, who had been standing off to the side, watching the situation unfold in silence. The tension in the air was thick, but the manager hadn't intervened yet, as if waiting for something. It wasn't clear if he was deciding whether to step in or if he simply wanted to see how the young worker would handle the situation. But enough was enough. The manager had seen enough of this young worker's behavior. He remembered the words of his boss, how he had been instructed to resolve this matter and, if necessary, fire the employee. His patience had run out. Without a moment's hesitation, the manager stepped forward, cutting through the tension with his sharp tone. "That's enough," he said, his voice hard and commanding. "You've crossed the line. Your disrespect for this elderly man is unacceptable. Do you think you can just treat people like this? That you can push them aside and pretend there are no consequences?" The young worker froze, her cocky attitude evaporating in an instant. She had expected to get away with her behavior, but now the manager was stepping in, and she knew that this was not going to go her way. She looked between the manager and Tulsi, her bravado faltering. The manager's eyes locked on the young workers, unblinking and unforgiving. This isn't just about a complaint or a customer. This is about basic decency. Senior citizens deserve our respect, not our dismissiveness. You're here to serve people, not ignore them when it's inconvenient for you. His voice grew even colder. And if you don't understand that, then maybe you shouldn't be working in a customer-facing job. The young worker shifted uneasily, but still she said nothing. She hadn't expected such a harsh confrontation, and she didn't know how to respond. Turning to Tulsi, the manager's expression was grim as he asked, "What do you want us to do with her?" There was no hesitation in Tulsi's demeanor as she met his gaze. She could see the anger in his eyes, the determination to make sure the worker understood the weight of her actions. "Teach her a lesson," she said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. "That's all." The manager nodded slowly, a sense of resolve settling in his posture. The young airline worker, though confused, was still too arrogant to fully comprehend the weight of her actions. But as the manager stepped forward, his expression hardened, and the worker began to feel the shift. This wasn't going to be an easy escape. The manager addressed the worker, his voice stern and commanding. "You've made a mistake, and actions have consequences. This isn't just about a complaint, it's about respect, dignity, and decency." He paused, locking eyes with the worker. "Your job is to help people, especially seniors, not dismiss them." The young worker flinched, not used to being spoken to in this way. Her shoulders tensed, and her gaze flickered nervously to the crowd, as if she might find some support in the people who had watched the exchange unfold. But the silence from the onlookers only amplified her discomfort. They were no longer passive observers. They had witnessed her behavior, and they knew she had wronged the elderly man. The manager continued, his tone growing sharper. "The code is clear. We're here to serve. Fail to do that, and there are consequences. I could have you fired and make sure you don't find another job in this industry. Is this acceptable to you?" The young worker blinked, clearly taken aback. "But I didn't do anything wrong," she protested, her voice small now, but still tinged with defensiveness. "You didn't do anything wrong," the manager repeated, his voice growing colder. "You ignored a senior citizen in need. You made him feel less than human. That is a failure of basic human decency, and it's a direct violation of the standards we uphold here." Tulsi had been standing at the edge of the conversation, but her attention was still fully on the young worker. The intensity of her gaze remained, silently urging her to understand the weight of the moment. She had given her an opening, a chance to reflect on her actions, but now it was up to her to accept it. Just as the young woman was about to speak again, Tulsi intervened, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "Enough," she said, her tone firm but measured. "You've made your point, but don't destroy her for this. We all make mistakes. This is her lesson." She turned to the manager, her gaze softening. "A fine, just a fine would suffice. Something to teach her, but don't take her job." The manager hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between his desire to correct the worker's behavior and Tulsi's reasonable plea. He had been ready to escalate this, but something about her quiet insistence, her aura of authority, made him pause. He looked from Tulsi to the young worker, who was now standing stock still, her face red with shame. It was clear that the young woman was starting to realize the gravity of her actions. "All right," the manager said after a long pause. "A fine. We'll issue a fine. But this is your one warning. Don't ever forget this lesson." He turned to the young worker with a look that brooked no argument. "Understand?" The young worker, her head hanging low, muttered an almost inaudible, "Yes, sir." Tulsi gave the manager a small nod, satisfied with the resolution. She had seen something in this young woman, maybe not a change, but a crack in the armor of her arrogance. That would be enough for now. The airline worker slowly turned toward the elderly man, who had been quietly watching the entire exchange. The guilt washed over her in waves, and she took a deep breath before walking over to the man. I'm really sorry," she stammered. "I shouldn't have treated you like that. I was wrong." The elderly man, still disoriented but grateful for the apology, nodded slightly. "It's all right, son. Just remember to show kindness, all right? We all have our bad days." The young worker nodded vigorously, now visibly shaking. She knew she had been wrong, but the weight of her mistake had only just hit her fully. She turned to Tulsi, her eyes filled with regret. "And I'm sorry to you too. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Tulsi offered her a quiet smile, her expression softer now. "It's not about causing trouble. It's about doing what's right. You'll be okay. Just remember that." As Tulsi turned to leave, the young woman watched her walk away, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had just been given a rare second chance, one that she didn't fully deserve, but was determined to make the most of. After Tulsi disappeared into the crowd, the young worker, still shaken, asked her manager, "Who was she?" The manager, watching her retreat, sighed. "She's someone who commands respect, with or without a title. You're lucky she didn't make this worse for you." Still in awe, the young worker pressed, "But who is she?" The manager replied, "She's someone who fights for what's right, and sometimes that's enough to change a person." The young woman fell silent, processing everything. For the first time in a while, she realized she had learned a lesson that would stick with her. Never underestimate the power of kindness or the quiet strength of someone who knows how to use it. If this encounter had you reflecting on your own values, the next chapter will push those thoughts even further. Click the video on your screen to immerse yourself in another unforgettable story, one that will stir emotions, ignite discussions, and linger in your mind long after the credits roll. Don't just watch, feel it. Your next adventure is only a click away.